would like to start off, before we get too deep in today's program, I really want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. We got three great sponsors that make all this possible. The first is Method, which is a digital software development agency. We do a lot of work ranging from customer experience to digital transformation. And Jeff says, did somebody say traveling happy hour? Why, yes, traveling happy hours are always on the agenda. So I want to thank Method for supporting the program, as well as Pragmatic Institute that's been supporting Product Coffee and Product Camp since the very beginning back in 2009. Want to really be thankful to the Pragmatic Institute team for joining us in pulling together this community. And finally, Feature Upvote, which is software that allows product managers to gather direct feedback from their customers, or Mervyn, in your situation, in your circumstance, direct feedback from your constituents, and help them directly rank in a very democratic method in real time their preferences, the most important initiatives that you can focus on their behalf, make suggestions directly to the product team, have conversations about them online. You can go to featureupvote.com and check that out. You can also see it on our ideas forum at productcoffee.com/ideas. You'll see that tool in action. This is where we take suggestions for future programs, and you can vote on the ideas that you see and share your thoughts and feedback there. And we actually use that as we're kind of planning out the schedule for the year for Product Coffee. So today, we are going to be covering the Kano model, as we've been kind of talking about, and using it in the real world. And to do that, I want to welcome my friend and colleague, Steve Whitby. Steve, why don't you introduce yourself and kick this thing off? It's all yours.
Hey y'all, I'm Steve Whitby. I'm located in Charlotte. Friends with a couple of you as I look some faces around, so it's nice to see y'all. My background is by education is in economics, and has had a strong behavioral focus over the years. So if you want to talk nerdery and English tax policy, I'd love to talk that through with you at some point. But for the last 25 years or so, I've been in customer experience strategy and product development on the nonprofit side. So basically how to make an impact in people's lives with $0 at your disposal. And that's led to a lot of fun explorations. I now work with Method, doing experience strategy and product strategy for both software products and physical products. And so that's how I got introduced to the Kano model a few years ago, and had to apply through several client engagements. And I found it really to be a liberating and empowering tool to point me in the right direction. That's really what I'm most concerned about when I'm trying to learn from customers and learn about potential future efforts, is what direction should I be pointed? So I do want to talk about Kano today, not as a perfect prioritization tool, but as a pointing and classification tool. I'll tell you what I mean by that in just a couple of minutes, but my hope is by the end of this, you'll see the relevance in why talking about the absence of clean toilets is important. We need to understand why my daughter wants her next phone, and potentially we can talk about the power of monthly subscriptions and the ones that you've forgotten in your bank account. So we'll get to those in just a minute, but the format that I want to walk through, if it's okay with everybody, is we're going to talk a little bit about just a really quick overview of what the Kano method or the Kano model is, what it isn't, that kind of thing, just so we have a general overview on that. We're going to talk about what we want to measure, what we can measure and what we can't measure by using the Kano model. Then we'll talk about some classifications that it helps us to understand. And then at that point, if you'd like to go grab more coffee, you can take a nap, but we're going to talk about math after that, and exactly how the model comes to the conclusions that it does, or how we come to the conclusions using its math. I will tell you that this is definitely survey level with that, or very high level. I'm going to show you sort of a little bit behind the curtain of how that math works, but I'm happy to talk with any of you individually or send you my spreadsheets that I've built over the years on how to actually make the math work for you, happy to do that, but I'm not going to get into all of the nitpicky sides of that. That's much more of a follow-up conversation, if that's okay. So with that as a launching off point, feel free to make this as conversational as you want. Happy to answer questions as we go. I'm happy to discuss any of the points also. We do have an exercise that I want to go through at the very end of this. So I'll try to give you a little bit or a chunk of info, and then hopefully we can apply it just a little bit, potentially even design an incredible product together or something like that. So with that as an intro, let's talk about what Kano is, what it isn't, where it came from. It's about 40 years old, came from essentially a researcher in Tokyo who was looking actually at a collection of American research at the time into workplace dynamics and workplace satisfaction, and sort of what were the determiners in industrial workplaces for customer satisfaction and for worker satisfaction. And the very one of the funny points that both the American researcher and the Japanese researcher came to was that clean toilets have two different kinds of value, or toilets have two different kinds of value in a workplace. A clean toilet is sort of a must-have. It's sort of a light switch. The toilet's either clean or it's not. If there's a clean toilet for you to use during the day, you're relatively satisfied in your workplace, is what he was finding in these industrial settings. That was an actual differentiator. There was this must-have of, I have to have a clean toilet available to me. If I don't, I will be dissatisfied all the time. But there's no way to make the toilet more clean. Having it was a good thing, not having it was a bad thing, but there wasn't a version of the toilet that was better. There was no magical crystal, I don't know, Cadillac of toilets that made your day better. And so they dug into this and to see if it could apply in more ways. And at its core, we'll talk about this in a second, it was about, they were trying to measure whether you could see the value of having something versus the value of not having something. And while those sound like the same thing, they're really different, particularly in a product environment. To look at the value of adding more of something, adding it well, making it perform better, or just the overall absence of it, and seeing how they impact customers and their feelings directly. So this is from one of the original researchers. Conveniently, his name is Kano, but a product is about much more than just functionality. It's also about customers' emotions. We want to know what they expect, but also what will delight them. So this tool, we hope, will lead us to understanding the value of certain features, whether they are something that's sort of table stakes that you have to have, or whether this is something that we could potentially delight a customer with, or whether we could actually send them away by having or not having a feature. So, question we want to ask today is, how do we go beyond satisfaction and expectation into delight? And therefore, the empowering question should be, where should we invest limited resources to gain the most benefit? These classifications that I'm going to introduce to you are not rated in general on a scale of bad to good. They help us understand where a feature lies, and we can make choices based on what our hopes for the product are, or the environment that we're creating, or the experience that we want a customer to have, and choose from the different buckets of classifications, or avoid some buckets of classification in order to better construct what we want to do. So why should I use Kano type testing? And there's lots of offshoots of this. I'm using a particular way that I've interpreted this over the years, so I apologize if I've bastardized the original research, but at some point we have to make everything our own. So this is my branch. There are a solid 10 or 12 other branches that I've seen taken with this. I don't think any are more right or more wrong, but for me, this approach is most effective for teams in need of guidance to figure out which minimum threshold features they absolutely must build, which performance features we should start investing in now for the future, and which customer delight features will deliver the biggest customer wow for the buck. The three biggest categories that we want to investigate and discover today are those sort of minimum threshold things that we have to build. What do we invest in for the future in a performance way? And what do we think will absolutely delight our customers? So in the end, we're going to talk about how to survey customers in a way that we can put features or potential features into one of 5 categories. So we want to understand what those categories are, what the simple questions are that get us there, and what the math is that backs it up. So everyone with me at this point? Any thumbs up on fantastic? I'll take that as I'm not speaking too much gibberish at this point. Perfect. So I want to start with the super simple question of what are we measuring when we talk about using Kano, because there are a ton of different ways to measure customer satisfaction, engagement, value, all that. We're going to actually try to measure two different things or explore two different things with the Kano model. We're going to talk about customer satisfaction, which is about feature performance, which is about how people like something, how they choose to interact with it, that kind of thing. And we're also going to talk about feature functionality, which is on a range of a feature is not present to, oh yeah, it works fine, all the way to this is the best of breed, this is leading class kind of thing. We want to measure the functionality of the feature, and in all of the graphs that we'll see, that will be on our left to right axis on the bottom, with the left side being this feature is not present. On the far right, the farther you go to the right, it's the better version of that feature that we have. We're always going to measure from bottom to top in terms of customer satisfaction. The very bottom is not just dissatisfaction, it is actual frustration, which is worse than dissatisfaction. The top that we move towards is delight, which is pure joy from a customer. So we're going to measure those two things and plot our results against them. Importantly, we want to measure at any given time in two directions. We're going to measure the value or the presence of a feature or a function, but we also want to measure the impact of its absence. Because when you plot those against each other, it reveals far more than just, do you like this? Or do you understand how it works? Do you value it? It's what happens when it's gone or it never existed in the first place. Does that tell us anything about its value in the future? So first of all, does that make sense? Any questions on what we're trying to measure there or what we're trying to evaluate, how I'm differentiating those two things? Great. All right, we got a lot to get through, so let's move pretty quickly. There's 5 classifications. If we use a couple of simple questions that I'll introduce in just a minute and plot functionality versus customer satisfaction, it can help us to put features that we're investigating into one of 5 categories. I'm going to walk through what those 5 categories are. You can ask questions as we go, or we can do that at the very end. The first feature classification I'm going to call must-haves. You'll see on all of these slides there's a couple of different names for things, because depending on which version of writing you're seeing on Kano, they call it different things. This one I call a must-have, which is the expected features. These are the table stakes. These are the, if your product, if your experience doesn't have this, no one's going to buy it, or the people that buy it are going to be instantly dissatisfied or frustrated. So you'll see in the very bottom left, basically the customer will be frustrated when it is not present, but they just basically get to neutral. They never really go much above neutral, no matter how good that feature gets, because it's a must-have. When you get to the point of basic functionality, you've reached sort of neutral satisfaction with your customer. So that is, on a phone, although my kids don't use their phones for this, on a phone, if it doesn't make phone calls, it's not actually a phone. That's a must-have. If your phone doesn't make a phone call at all, you'll have complete frustration from day one. It's amazing to me that we still call them phones, even though the actual telephonic nature of it is probably the least valued feature out there anymore. But it's a must-have. It's table stakes. So that's category number 1. That's a must-have. Category number 2. These are one-dimensional, and these are our performance features. These are, yes, the customer will be very frustrated if it is not present, but the better we get at it, or the more of it we have, the more satisfaction we will gain with the customer. So this is pretty much a linear left to right. It's up and to the right. Great examples of this are things like Dropbox storage. In the very, very beginning, when you could earn your way up to, let's say, 1 gig of storage, the more you had, the more satisfied you were with the product, because they were selling essentially secure storage. And now you can get hundreds and hundreds of gigs. You can get terabytes of storage there. And their goal is to constantly provide more and more and more. And the more they provide, likely the more satisfaction they will drive, especially in their basic customer set. So The one-dimensional features also can be evaluated in A/B. In an example of, I'm amazed that you can go to McDonald's and you can buy a 32-ounce drink for $1, or you can buy a 24-ounce drink for $1. I don't know why you would choose to buy the 24-ounce drink for $1, other than potentially it doesn't fit in my cup holder or something like that. But basically, two products of two sizes of different value, because you get more in the 32-ounce cup, both for $1. I'm likely to buy the 32-ouncer because I want more of that product. That's second category, one-dimensional, a performance feature. The third one, delighter, and this is our holy grail. This is where we want to get, particularly with newer products, but this is an attractive feature. Basically, the wrinkle that we're adding here that wasn't in the first two is when this feature is not present, customer doesn't care. Most of the time because they don't know it exists yet. The customer starts at neutral in this. A lack of functionality in this area does not dissatisfy or frustrate the customer. It's just not there. They weren't planning on it. They didn't want it. The better we get at implementing it, the farther we move towards best in breed, the more customer satisfaction goes up. So these are the differentiators that really make an application or a device or an experience stand out. These are the features that customers don't expect at all. So these are things like, if I go and travel, I expect that I'm going to have my standard double-double. I went this past weekend, I was in Tennessee dropping my kids off at camp. We show up at the hotel, and with no ask, no expectation, no nothing at all, they upgraded us to a higher floor with a slightly different access in the hotel. That was a pure delight. I didn't expect it in any way, shape, or form. They gave me a better experience with no expectation to start with. I would have been perfectly happy with the standard room that we purchased. But that was a moment of delight for me, where they got to say, I'm going to add something else on that you don't need, but you're going to love just a little bit. So those are our three categories that we want to shoot for and understand the positive value. So as I said, we were going to measure the value of having something, but also the value of not having something. There's two categories that we need to understand that are a little bit more, well, we should avoid these. The first is the indifferent or the unimportant feature category. And so this is the customer starts at neutral when you don't have it, and they stay at neutral even when it's fantastic. So this is things like, this was a great example. A waiter said to me at one point, was explaining to me why my experience was going to be better at a restaurant, because they had just upgraded their point of sale system. So everything was going to, in their mind, be easier for them to do their job. I saw no difference from the last time I visited that restaurant to this time that I visited that restaurant. They were all excited about it. They had a new point of sale system. Wonderful, fantastic. Did jack squat for me. So they saw value in providing that for their employees, but for the customer, nothing. It's an indifferent, it's a, I don't care if you have it. It's completely unimportant. This is the water bottle that gets thrown in when you buy a Tesla. No one's buying a Tesla because you get a free water bottle out of it. Unimportant feature completely. Final one is our detractors. These are undesirable features. And it's sort of tough to imagine that these actually exist, but people put a lot of time and effort, and I apologize if any of you were involved in the development of Clippy in the 1990s, one of my least favorite product features that has ever existed. So I can tell the age of the people that are smiling right now, because you were working in Microsoft Office in the late 1990s when Clippy showed up as an assistant. And this was when the feature's not there, I don't care. But if you give me more of it, I'm going to hate you for it. I'm going to actually use this product less. If you don't know what Clippy was, it was this little animated paperclip that would show up as you're writing a Word document and suggest things to you, not actually put them in the document, but suggest them to you, type them out on the screen. And most of the time, they were just wrong. They were just flat out wrong. They'd ask you questions. Are you trying to do this? And the answer would be, no, I'm not trying to do that. Please shut up. And in the very, very beginning, you couldn't even turn it off. That was a detractor. It was a feature that someone spent effort on, and in the end, no one wanted. So I would love to see what that looks like now, but that was a terrible feature in the very beginning. So those are our 5 categories. I want to make a quick side trip to tell you that Features don't stay in a category for very long. There's something called feature decay, which is things that start out as attractors will eventually decay, start out as attractors or delighters, will eventually decay into the other categories. An example being, when the iPhone came out, it was revolutionary to have a touch screen that you could scroll on your phone. This beautiful, amazing touchscreen where I could reveal apps and all these kind of things. Absolutely a delighter at the time. Now, if you buy a phone without a touchscreen, well, actually, I probably wouldn't buy a phone without a touchscreen. It's now table stakes. It is a must-have. In just a short 10 or 15 years, that has gone from the ultimate delighter to a absolute must-have. Things can move very quickly from that delight category into the performance category, into the must-have category. The natural progression of most products, though, and we can talk about this in our exercise in a minute, is most things actually don't start in the delighter or attractor. They start in the unimportant. They start out as indifferent because customers don't understand them. As an example, Windows had put out a touchscreen phone several years before. Because of their implementation, it was essentially an unimportant feature. People didn't buy into it because of how well they had implemented it. It took a while for customers to come on board to the point that this was now a delighter. So those are our 5 categories. I want to make sure that we understand feature decay because it's worth investigating on a constant basis where our features are now, not just where they were when we explored them for deployment or for build or for initial testing. So in just a couple of minutes, I want to talk about how do we interpret the data to get to this point. It would feel like to classify in this way, it would be a relatively complicated process to get the data that we need. And let me tell you, it's absolutely incredibly simple if you follow some very basic rules. So at its core, we measure these 2 areas, customer satisfaction and feature functionality, by asking 3 questions. We ask 2 parallel questions to start out with. We describe the feature through a scenario of some kind. And then we ask, how would you feel if a product had this feature? And then ask a parallel question in the exact same way, how would you feel if a product did not have this feature? And ask them to answer the same scale on both of those. I like it, I expect it, I'm neutral, I can tolerate it, or I dislike it. You can massage them a little bit as long as the scale stays the same. You ask those 2 questions about the same feature and ask the customer to answer both. And then the third question is, how important would it be for this product, for a product to have this feature? And then you give them a Likert where you're answering, 1 to 5, 1 to 6 of, dissatisfaction or disliked all the way up to like. The answers of these reveals enough for us to map a customer's answer or where it belongs on that scale. Let me show you what I mean. If we were to chart the responses with, on the left, the bottom to top being, we're going to chart where a customer says what they believe or what they feel if a feature is there. Do they dislike it on the bottom, all the way up to they like it on the top if it is there. And then across left to right, we're going to measure, what if the feature is absent? Do you like it on the left or dislike it on the right? If we line up their answers in this grid, we will see how they value the feature. So as an example, if when asked about a feature being present, a customer says, I don't really care, I'm neutral. And then we ask, well, what happens if it's not there? And they say, well, I kind of don't care either. That puts it firmly in the indifferent category. It's an unimportant feature. If they don't care if it's there, and if they don't care if it's not there, it's pretty easy to understand. Don't necessarily need it. Well, let's look at what happens if, when the feature is there, I really, really like it. And when the feature's not there, I guess I don't really care. I'm going to put that in the attractor category because the customer's starting at neutral in having it, and I know the better they really like having it, so the better I do, the more it's going to delight them. Last one. If a customer expects to have it and dislikes not having it, that is a must-have. So by charting those 2 responses, you can find all the categories, all the 5 that we talked about before, and then one quirky, crazy little extra category, which we're not going to spend much time on. But if you look, I've circled the A's for attractors or delighters in the yellow. In the upper right-hand corner, you see the one-dimensional or the performers. And then on the right side, you see the must-haves. We want our features to fall into one of those categories. We distinctly do not want our features to be in the far left or far bottom. That is where we are in the reverse or the detractor type of feature. Now you see those cues. We won't dive into that too deeply. I can send you a paper on it if you want at some point, but the cues basically means we're bad at asking questions because they answered, if I've got it, I love it. If I don't have it, I love it. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Or if I don't have it, I hate it. And if I have it, I hate it. That answer doesn't make sense either. So those cues are, if you start seeing a lot of those in your results, that typically means you did not design your study well enough, or you did not ask your question clearly enough, or what is most often happens is you didn't explain the feature well enough for the customer to understand what they were reacting to. So that's all of our categories. This looks a little bit complex. It comes from, you can literally by hand score everyone's responses and just count up. Okay, if I had 10 respondents and 6 of them said this is an A or an attractor, a delighter, and everybody else said it's a one-dimensional thing, well, that's a great feature to have. And I'm going to call that a delighter. I'm going to call it an attractor. You can hand score it. Or there's lots of spreadsheets out there. I've built a few. There are several other people that have built a few that go levels of complexity that will actually help you do that charting for larger customer sets. Larger feedback sets. So I've done it as large as having 200 people respond to the same two, but that will chart it for you and tell you, well, we have the most O's or the most M's or the most I's. So I see a raised hand. What's the question on the table?
So I didn't understand what reverse means.
Reverse is just a different word for the detractor, basically. I probably should have updated the language. The reverse is the guy that actually came up with this way of graphing. He calls it reverse. I call it detractor, where basically if you don't have the feature, people like it. Anyway, it's the detractor category. So those gray R's that are around the left-hand side are the land we should avoid. Great question. Does that answer for you?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So there's ways to graph out the math in a more automated way by just dumping all of your responses on scale of 1 to 5. It can map out, these two pairs of numbers equals an M, equals an O, equals an R, whatever. You add those up. You can add those up like this, which shows you for the first feature on the list, the O category in the middle circled is a 25. That's the highest rated of all of them. So therefore, this feature is going to rate out as an O. You can go much deeper into the math here to look at importance ratings. It tells you that. It can give you the strength of it by the value of that span number on the far right. All of these are in the resources that I have put at the end of this deck. Clickable resources to go through to explore further. Also, happy to talk to you about how to implement this for yourself. I'm approaching the information that I'm giving you mostly from the perspective of, if you need to have an intelligent conversation about this, these are the classifications, this is how the study works, and this is how the math gets us where we're going to be. But I realize this is not enough time in any way, shape, or form to teach you how to do all of these and interpret these. The magic of charting things out like this, and I see George Joy's in the room. I think I actually sat down with him one day and walked through a set of features on this to look at the differences of, what if there's numbers that are close together? What if there's a wide spread in those numbers? What if there's two that match up? What do we learn if the two that are the highest are in disagreement with each other? Those are fascinating conversations to have and can help you actually start to prioritize and not just classify. So you can get down into the minutia of how those numbers evaluate against each other instead of just going to, here's our first classification. So that's the basic of how the math gets us to those classifications. We're going to do an exercise on this in just a second, but I want to give you just a couple of best practices when you hear people talking about this or when you think about implementing this for the first time. And this comes directly from, instead of calling this best practices, I should probably start with ways Steve has screwed this up in the past. And so don't do those, but do this better. So the first one is be specific. The power of Kano is in specificity. Don't ask about 5 features in one question. Get really good at describing one feature well, so that the customer understands. I had a group of responses come back where over 70% of the responses were in the questionable category, meaning I'd explained a feature that they loved having and loved not having at the same time, or hated having and hated not having at the same time. 70% of people basically were completely confused by what I was explaining to them. So be as specific as possible when asking about the feature that you're exploring. Second, be finite. Because of the way these questions are asked and because of how well you need to explain the features, we need to be finite in the number of features that we ask about at a time. I was once asked to do a study for a customer, for a client, and they wanted us to test 40 features against Kano in the course of essentially one day. One customer research group, they wanted 40 features tested, and that is a big red X no. There is a real factor of fatigue that goes into this, and so I've found it's very difficult to test more than 8 to 10 in any given short amount of time. It is much better to be finite, to narrow down to what you want to ask about today and get real results, better than getting a dump of data that's just really not all that useful. So be finite is number 2. And number 3 is follow up. Yes, this is a preliminary quantitative number that gets us towards qualitative. I have found these to be most revealing results when we're actually able to follow up with customers and say, okay, it looks like this is a delighter. Now I want to know why, because it doesn't tell us why this would be a delighter or why this would be a performance indicator where I just need more of it or better of it for you. Follow up and ask qualitative questions so that you can get much more narrative answers. So there's my 3 best practices for you: is be specific, be finite, and follow up. In the end, as we go to trying to create a couple of examples here, there's 5 categories that we want to understand, 5 classifications that we want to understand where our features can fall. By understanding where they fall in that, it's easier to decide where our resources can be placed against those. Because if we see an entire group of features that are in the must-have category and we are not performing well on those at all yet, that is where we put our dollars. That is where we put our resources. If we see that we're actually executing relatively well in the must-haves, then that's our opportunity to look at what are the performers that are out there, or what are our unimportant or indifferents that we can start to convert into attractors or delighters by paying attention to why a customer might want them in the long run, better understanding it or better desiring it. So be specific, be finite, follow up, investigate the 5 classifications and see where your potential features might lie. So happy to answer any questions right now, or Jason, I don't know if you want to reappear and help us get into some breakout rooms to talk about a specific way to brainstorm through these. But it looks like we might have a question from Matt.
Thanks, Steve. Very useful framework here to begin diving into. My question is really related to the 5 categories in particular when it comes to making improvements. So if you're in, say, the performance features, or you've got a feature that's starting to move into that category, how do you know where to stop before you've done too much? Do you need to periodically survey your customers? What are some strategies for that?
That's a great question. That's where the follow-up concept becomes really important. It's easy to put it in the performer category, the one-dimensional, sort of the more is better idea, but without asking why or what value is being provided, it's very difficult to understand where that finishing point is. Because yes, at some degree, there's going to be diminishing returns. Understanding where that line is doesn't come from looking at just the Kano numbers. I would, in that case, if I had access to the raw data, I would be looking at what the importance scores were that we got. Let's say it's in the performance category. Is it performing plus it has a high importance? Because then I would want to ask, can we continue? Or is it performance, but it's actually low importance? It's just, you have to give me more, but I don't really value it all that much. I'm just going to go to a competitor if they're providing more. So I would do the follow-up category there and ask some narrative questions of why is it valuable to you? Because then that gives me a lot better target of when I might need to sort of ramp back providing more because it's diminishing in the return there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thanks.
Steve, it looks like we got a couple of questions in the chat. One came from Smith, and he said, would you apply rice after you got the list?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of different ways to place prioritization against this. I will say from my experience, I have not directly applied rice immediately afterwards. I like to help customers understand which category we should point towards first and then have them drive the conversation of prioritization within that. But yes, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think the data provides an invitation to actually go to prioritization after that and understanding what direct impact will be within a classification. But this, as I said in the very beginning, the idea is to point you in the right direction, and then your flavor of choice after that for a prioritization tool is where I'd go. What you're most comfortable or what your customer is most comfortable with.
Very good. And it looks like we have a question from Mervyn.
Yeah, hi. In terms of being specific and then being finite, do you ask a question? I'm thinking now in terms of promoting environmental issues of rewilding areas. So would you ask a question like, I don't know, do you think bees are important pollinators? And then that's just a very simple question. And then you ask your number of questions about providing areas for bees to forage on flowers or whatever. And then how do you structure that? Because one of the issues that we have locally in the district in which I live now, there's a big emphasis on changing people's attitudes in relation to climate change and getting them to buy into the fact that areas can be left wild and that wild is beautiful, and scalping everything to within an inch of its life is not. That's the big issue that's on here at the moment. And that's what I'm trying to get my head around, how to phrase an initial resident survey, if you like, to try and get the feedback of what people are thinking and how to bring them on board.
I love that question because it really takes a creative approach to how you ask better questions. And so I would try to be as value neutral as possible on the question that you ask and better describe the scenario prior to the questions. So laying out essentially, here's how the pollination process works with bees. Here's the plants that they help grow in our communities. Here's the impact of that. Describe that as a scenario, and then potentially offer your functional and dysfunctional questions, your yes/no questions. Your on/off questions as if the open spaces in your neighborhood had space for pollinators, how would you feel? If the open spaces in your neighborhood did not have space for pollinators or whatever, how would you feel? So basically giving two opposing the with it, without it, is described in the scenario ahead. Basically, you need to describe it without attaching too much value to it. Just explain what the role of pollinators is, and then saying, in city planning, we can create parks that are pollinator friendly. Would you value a park that is pollinator friendly, or how would you feel? How would you feel if your park was not pollinator friendly? That kind of thing. You could actually get some interesting content from that, and I'd be happy to talk to you offline, because I'm now fascinated by the idea of how do you apply this to sort of environmental thought and selling an idea instead of just an actual product feature.
Yeah, that would be great if you got the time. I'm really sort of passionate about this, and people, you need to get people on board, but you've got to bring them willingly, if you like. Once you try and push people, then the reaction is probably more than the push that you're applying.
Yep. And really the complication with that is, how do you not pre-populate your answer in the question itself? How do you allow them to assign the value by just understanding the scenario that you're explaining? So that's a fascinating question.
Right, thank you.
Any
All
other
right.
questions you see, Jason?
Let's see. Mark was asking earlier, Mark Levis was asking earlier, are features independent of each other? I'm going to ask Mark to kind of jump on and expand on that question a little bit real quickly before we go off to the groups.
Oh, no, I wasn't asking a question. Somebody was asking about
gotcha.
applying rights, and I was just thinking about, I know that in the work that I do, the feature work that we do has dependencies. And so it's not as simple as just apply rice to it. It's also, how do the features interrelate to each other? And can you do one before you do the other? Are they completely independent? And just pick one and start going after it? That was the point that I was making.
Gotcha.
So more of a response to submit than to a question to the group.
I see we've got a couple of hands up. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you've got your hand still up, if you drop your question in the chat, and we'll try to get back to it. I want to break us off into some groups right now. We've got a little exercise that'll let us work in some groups for about 10 minutes. And it's okay. You want to go ahead and talk about that a little bit, or do you want me to just kind of walk them through it real quick, Steve?
Why don't you just walk them through it? I think you've got the survey itself, so.
Yeah, so what we've done is we're going to break off into breakout rooms, and we put together a survey that I'm going to paste the link in for you here. And what this survey does, and I'm just put it right here, is it will give you a list of product categories. And that list will be randomized on your survey. So what we want you to do is, when you take the first one on the list, when it comes up, and just put a check in that box. Let me actually share my screen for just a second so you'll see what we're talking about. Here we go. The link that I just gave you will give you this survey on using the Kano model in the real world. And when you get into your breakout room, drop just one person from the team needs to do this. Drop your breakout room number into the survey here, and then check off the first category and the second category that you see on the survey. They'll be randomized for everyone. And then as a team, discuss what are some potential must-haves. What do you think the must-haves might be for the category that showed up first for you? So if yours were restaurants, what are some features or characteristics that, if you were doing a Kano analysis, you believe and expect would show up as must-haves? What are performers? What are the delighters? What do you think people are indifferent about? And what do you think are actual detractors? And it's just kind of a thought exercise to discuss as a group, get to know each other a little bit, and think through these concepts in a little bit more active way. If you have time, go on to the second category on your list, whatever that may be, and work through the same exercise. So we're going to break off into these groups for about 10 minutes. I'm going to bring you back in at about 5 minutes till the top of the hour. And then we will hear from one of the teams or maybe two of the teams on what their takeaways were. If you have to leave, make sure that you fill out the Product Coffee survey that's on the resources page. You'll also get an email shortly. Fill that out for us and let us know how this session worked for you. So I'm going to now break everyone out into the breakout rooms. And we will see you back here at 8:55 Eastern. If I can find the breakout rooms button. There we go. And I'm going to try to put you in groups of about 4. So enjoy your time together. So I want to thank Steve for joining us for today's session. It's been fantastic. It's been a really great session today. So thank you so much for bringing this great content, and we'll get the recording out on YouTube. Don't forget to fill out the survey when you leave. That really helps us understand what we can do better and how to improve things. So the first one that we had submitted, breakout room number 3, it had George, Desi, TJ, and Steve, who was clicking that button at the last second. You had restaurants and cars. For restaurants, there are must-haves where you had to have food, drink, and bathrooms. Even a bathroom was a must-have. That in Georgia, legally you have to. In some places you don't, so that's interesting. Performers, good service and fresh food. Delighters, free dessert, free appetizers, happy hour deals. Those are some good delighters. Indifferent, menu, booth versus menu, or booth versus chairs. Interesting.
Sorry.
And detractors, uncleanliness, long wait times, or lack of online pre-ordering. Is that what it was?
No, that was online presence.
Oh, presence. Okay, gotcha.
Wait times is a great one because that's an unintentional detractor where the popularity of a restaurant because of their delighters or because of their performers goes way up, and the wait time, which is perceived as fantastic for the restaurateur, for the owner, but in the end creates these super long wait times for customers, and that detractor can outweigh the performer or the delighter there, because you never get to experience the food that is bringing people in. So I love that as an example.
Yeah, it is a great one. Let's see, what did we have for the next one that came in? We had group 7. They had mobile phones. So make phone calls, text. Look at all these must-haves now, to your point from earlier. Must be able to make phone calls and text and do alerts and do notifications and have sound and have contact books and have basic privacy features. Performers were still, in this team's opinion, Wi-Fi capability and internet access. So it wasn't an absolute must-have, but it was definitely a performer. And then the quality of internet access, is it 3G, 4G, 5G? Delighters, advanced privacy features and cameras. Indifferent, ability to change the background, the size of the phone for some people.
The delighters right there, what a great example. The privacy features, I promise you 10 years ago, that was an indifferent or an unimportant when it came to mobile phones and cell technology. No one cared because they weren't even paying attention to, or the vast majority of your users were not paying attention to privacy and security 10, 12, 15 years ago with their phones. They just assumed it was unimportant. Absolutely now a selling feature and a delight if you can prove how well you do security or how privacy is protected. Love that movement from unimportant into delighter there.
That was a great one. So, and it is 9 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hope you can join us next week for our book discussion on the Lean Product Playbook by Dan Olson. And we will send out a survey for you to fill out. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll get the invitation to that next session later on today as well. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, Method, for supporting us. Thank you, Pragmatic Institute. And thank you, Feature Upvote. And thanks, everyone, for attending. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Take care. Bye.
Thanks all.